Week 12 of the NFL season is finally done, and let's go ahead and talk about some of the biggest winners and losers of Week 12. Now, I want to talk about 5 specific games because I think most of those games will kind of give you the big details of what you need to know about this week. And then at the very end of the video, I will briefly cover the Frank Reich firing for the Carolina Panthers. But without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about some of these big games. And we're going to go ahead and start off with the Thanksgiving games. We're not going to talk about the Dallas Cowboys one because that was pretty much domination. But briefly, I wanted to quickly talk about the Green Bay Packers versus the Detroit Lions. Now, obviously, heading into this game, the Detroit Lions were heavily favored, and honestly, rightfully so. Despite the fact that Green Bay Packers have been one of the more dominant teams within the past couple seasons, the Detroit Lions are by far the better team. Yet this week, the Detroit Lions lost with a score of 29-22, and Green Bay finally looks like they have their quarterback. In the post-Aaron Rodgers era, Jordan Love was supposed to become the guy, and through a couple weeks this year, it looked like it, and then some weeks it didn't look like it. This is one of those weeks that we see the vintage Jordan Love. On the day, he was 22 for 32 for 268 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he was on money the entire game, making good decisions. He was sharp, he was accurate. This is the best version of Jordan Love that we might have seen the entire season. And he didn't really get a whole lot of help from his run game. The leading rusher for this team was AJ Dillon, who had 14 carries for only 43 yards. So for anyone who thinks that Jordan Love gets carried by his run game, well, that was not the case this week. He was carrying that team. And they had a huge challenge this week going up against the Detroit Lions. Now, obviously, this game has probably zero implications for the future of this division, because unless Detroit has an absolute collapse later in the season, they're probably going to end up winning it. I will say though, if Detroit keeps losing some of these very winnable games and the Minnesota Vikings or Green Bay starts to win some games, could look a little scary for Detroit. But for right now, I think Detroit's pretty safe. So for Green Bay, this was a dominant win and a very good win against a very good team, and the future of this team might look a little bit better now. As for the Detroit Lions, the future of this team still is extremely bright, but this was a win that you had to get. Heading into this week, you were 8-2 and you had a really good chance to potentially jump to the number 1 seed in the NFC. Of course, you'd be hoping for a Philadelphia Eagles loss, but now you sit at 8-3 and the chances of you winning the NFC are pretty dim. And this is now 2 weeks in a row where Detroit has came from behind and started to put together a rally in that second half. It just so happened that this week they couldn't get the job done. And this is becoming a trend for the Detroit Lions. A lot of turnovers and defense is not playing that good. Am I concerned for the Lions? Not particularly. I think they will end up winning the division and having some success in the playoffs. But I do think if you're rating the Lions above teams like the 49ers, the Eagles, the Cowboys, you might have been overrating them. But for now, we'll have to wait and see how the rest of the season plays out for them. Next, let's move on to the final Thursday night game against the San Francisco 49ers versus the Seattle Seahawks. I've already made a full-fledged video about the Seahawks, so if you want to check that video out after this one, I'll have it linked at the very end. But for the San Francisco 49ers, this was a dominant win from start to finish. The Seattle Seahawks offense was completely anemic the entire game. They did not score a single touchdown, and that is obviously because the San Francisco 49ers have one of the best defenses in the entire NFL. Hell, I'd even argue they are the best. This team, talent for talent, is unstoppable, and with Brock Purdy playing like he did against the Seattle Seahawks, it's very hard to beat this team. I do think the Eagles have maybe a small leg up over the 49ers, but with both these teams matching up in just a couple weeks, I do think that is going to be an extremely, not only important game for the conference, but an extremely important game for the 49ers and their future in terms of how they feel about themselves. As for Seattle, again, I made a full-fledged video, but I'll briefly cover it here. You are in a bit of a pickle. They have a tough schedule, and they're now sit at 6-5 and have 2 losses to the LA Rams, which could have easily been wins. And now you're way falling behind in their own division, so I don't really know how to feel about the Seahawks team, especially when you look at the rest of the NFC and see some of these wildcard teams and how they're shaping out. If Seattle goes on a bit of a losing streak given their current schedule, they might be out of the playoffs completely. And then if you're Seattle, what do you do with Geno Smith? I don't know. It's a scary situation for Seattle, but for San Francisco, a great win and a great way to end off Thursday night. Now let's go ahead and move on to the battle of the AFC South, the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Houston Texans. Now, despite the fact that Houston Texans lost, I don't really consider them big-time losers this week, because ultimately their schedule is very favorable moving forward, so I do think they can potentially get back to potentially win this division later in the season, but obviously had you won this week, it would have been a huge help. Nonetheless, CJ Stroud still looked incredible. On the day, he was 26 for 36 for 304 touchdowns and accounted for 3 different touchdowns, and in fact, he was actually the leading rusher this week with 6 carries for 47 yards, which is just crazy. This game was without a doubt one of his better performances this year, and CJ Stroud is such a good player, and I do think that he might currently be the front runner for the MVP. It's kind of back and forth depending on which week it is. And this was a great week for his receiving core as Nico Collins and Tank Dell both had really sharp games. It just happened that they went up against a very good Jacksonville Jaguars team who ultimately does end up having the stranglehold on the division. Again, for Houston, I do think you're small losers this week because you did lose the division, and honestly, it's going to be very difficult to win it. But regardless of that, they're still a lock, more than likely to make the playoffs, and they look really good right now. As for the Jacksonville Jaguars, this is a great game for them. Trevor Lawrence looked good, Calvin Ridley looked good, the whole receiving core and the offensive line was pretty sharp throughout the game. They couldn't really get Travis Etienne going because of some injuries, but for the most part, the run game was solid. And defensively, they did just just enough to have enough 3 and outs and force enough punts to ultimately win this game. Sure, they couldn't slow down CJ Stroud, but there's not a lot of teams that can do that at this point. But for Jacksonville, the rest of the season is going to be very interesting. Their schedule is pretty favorable. They have the Bengals, the Browns, the Ravens coming up, and I think for the most part, the Bengals and the Browns, given their quarterback situation, should be pretty easy wins. I do think Baltimore will end up beating them, but if they beat Baltimore, that could potentially be the swaying that they need to win the AFC conference, because their last 3 games are against the Buccaneers, the Panthers, and the Titans, and they should be able to win all 3 of those games. So hypothetically speaking, if you win out and let's say Kansas City loses the game, I believe they win the AFC conference. And for Jacksonville, having home field advantage the rest of the season as well as a bye would be absolutely critical for their AFC championship run. Do I think they're better than the Chiefs or the Ravens? Not really, but ultimately if they do get that bye and have some more time to rest, get healthy, and game plan, that could be huge for them. I truthfully think that if Jacksonville does get the bye, they are true contenders, but if they don't, I don't think they're contenders. But nonetheless, this is an absolutely great win for Jacksonville against a very formidable opponent in the Houston Texans. But next up, we have our 2 3 o'clock games that I want to talk about: the Broncos versus the Browns, and then later we'll talk about the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Buffalo Bills. The Browns versus the Broncos was a pretty interesting game. The Browns were without, of course, Deshaun Watson, and ultimately went with DTR, and then later in the game, he got injured, so PJ Walker had to step up. So in a very bizarre week, the Broncos were just able to take care of business. And don't look now, but the Broncos now sit at 6-5, and they have a chance to make the fucking playoffs. Pardon my language, it's just incredible the turnaround the Broncos have had this season. It was just a few weeks ago that we were all making fun of Sean Payton for the comments he made about Nathaniel Hackett, but hell, he's 6-5 and Nathaniel Hackett sucks. So sure, round 1 Nathaniel Hackett, round 2 Sean Payton. And it's funny because Russell Wilson didn't really have a spectacular game. He was 13 for 22 for only 134 yards and 1 touchdown, but they were just able to do so many different things to win this game. They ran the ball effectively, they played good defense, and they just won this game somehow. And this Broncos team, they have beaten very good teams: the Chiefs, the Bills, now the Browns. Now you can say that each of those games had unique circumstances that allowed them to win this game, and I'm not going to sit here and deny it, but nonetheless, they have beaten some very, very good teams. And unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, they have a couple tough, brutal games ahead for them. Next week, they have the Houston Texans in a game that if they win that game, holy shit, the Broncos might be back. Then they have the Chargers, which the Chargers, as abysmal as they may be coaching-wise, they're still a very talented roster. Then you have the Lions, the Patriots, you should blow out by 50, Chargers again, and then Raiders. So if they do lose to Houston, and let's say they hypothetically lose to the Lions, but they take care of business in every single game, they will end up the season 10-6. And hell, if they win 5 of the next 6, they're going to end up with an 11-6 record. Now they won't win the division because Kansas City ultimately has a stranglehold on that one, of course. And barring a Chiefs collapse, the Broncos will more than likely be a wildcard team if they somehow slide into that playoff spot. But I promise you, nobody wants to play the Broncos because they play good defense and they just find ways to win games. Talent for talent, I don't think the Broncos match up with a team like the Baltimore Ravens or the Chiefs or the Jacksonville Jaguars. But I promise you, if one of those teams has to face Denver, Denver's going to give them everything they got and they might just win that game. So I don't know. Things are getting scary for the Denver Broncos. They look really good right now. But let's go ahead and now move on to the Buffalo Bills versus the Philadelphia Eagles game. For the Philadelphia Eagles, this is another good win for them. Maybe not the more dominant performance that they would like to have this week, but nonetheless, they won with a score of 37-34, and they currently have a 10-1 record, and barring some sort of collapse over the next couple weeks, they're going to end up winning the NFC Conference. And despite the fact that, again, I don't feel like they really honestly should have won this game, they find ways to win games. I felt the Dallas Cowboys had a better week than them, and they still beat them. I thought the Kansas City Chiefs played better than them, and they still beat them. And again, with the Buffalo Bills, I thought the Bills played better than them, but they still beat them. The Buffalo Bills had 505 total yards, and they still lost. And heading into the third quarter, Jalen Hurts statistically was not having a very good game at all. And then in the fourth quarter, they dominated, scoring 17 points and having 6 points added on in overtime, where they ultimately won the game. I don't want to sound like a hater here, and again, if I do sound like a hater, you guys can fix me in the comment section below. But I think the Philadelphia Eagles sitting 10-1, I think they're a very beatable roster. I think defensively, sure, they have a really good defensive line, but I think that secondary and that linebacking core is very suspect. And even if they do go out there and get a Shaquille Leonard, I don't think he's going to add that much to that defense. Again, you gave up 505 yards to the Buffalo Bills. The Dallas Cowboys were dicing you the whole game. In Kansas City, they could have potentially scored so many different times, but they just could not score in the red zone for whatever reason. I want to give them their flowers. They score points, they can move the ball offensively, and they have such a good game plan on how they win games. But they're beatable, and I do think the 49ers are going to beat them next week. Moving on to Buffalo, this was a huge loss for them. They currently sit at 6-6, and they have a brutal schedule still remaining. They are essentially going to have to go either 11-6, which means they'd have to go undefeated, or maybe lose one game for the rest of their schedule in order to have a chance to make the playoffs. Which, if this Buffalo team does not make the playoffs, I do think that would be a bit of a shame because they've been playing some really good football since the firing of their offensive coordinator. I don't really know what to say about this Buffalo Bills team other than the fact that they probably should have won this game. Sure, the officiating was bad, and that seems to be a trend for every single Philadelphia Eagles game at this point because the officiating was bad against the Dolphins, it was bad against the Chiefs, it was bad against the Cowboys, and now it's bad again for the Buffalo Bills. But I'm not going to let my personal hatred for how the NFL referees games dictate how I feel about this Eagles team. I thought I would just simply say that for my Buffalo Bills fans who feel like they got cheated out of a victory. I kind of understand. But ultimately, regardless of the penalties, the game was in the hands of the Buffalo Bills. They should have won. They had 2 missed field goals, 1 was blocked, an interception that obviously led to more points for the Philadelphia Eagles, and then in overtime, you had the ball first, and you didn't score a touchdown. So give credit where credit is due to the Philadelphia Eagles, but Buffalo, you had to have won this game, man. But lastly, like I promised, I did want to briefly cover the Frank Reich situation, and I personally consider Bryce Young to be a winner and a loser for this week. I know that might sound like I'm flipping a coin on which one I think he is, but you tell me, does he win in this situation or does he lose in this situation? Because sure, you got rid of the guy who was a terrible play caller, but now where do you go from here if you're Carolina? There's rumors coming out that Frank Reich did not want Bryce Young, he actually wanted CJ Stroud, but the front office wanted Bryce Young, which if there is any truth to that, I do think it was a bit shitty of that organization to force him to take Bryce Young. I still think Bryce is extremely talented. I do think that he will live up to that first overall pick, but obviously with the success that CJ Stroud is having is kind of putting a bit of a cloud over him right now. And then there's obviously enough to talk about with this Carolina Panthers team. They have no talent, they have no draft picks. What do you do with this current roster? And unfortunately, there's not going to be many head coaches that really want this position. Sure, the idea of being able to groom Bryce Young into becoming a great quarterback sounds amazing, but then you throw into account that there is no first overall pick for this team next year, and there's not much talent on this team. It kind of makes this position less shiny bright. Now, if somehow, some way they can somehow get Ben Johnson on this team, I think that would be an incredible hire, because not only has Ben Johnson made Jared Goff look really good, but he's also established an identity for that roster, which I think this Panthers team needs. So for Bryce, I'm happy that he finally gets off of Frank Reich, and I'm hopeful that in the future he's going to get a head coach who actually wants to have him. As for who they end up hiring, I think that'll dictate whether I think this is a good move or a bad move, but ultimately I'm kind of a bit of both with Bryce Young right now. But that is going to go ahead and conclude this video. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it helps me out a ton, as well as if you did enjoy it, make sure to share it with all your friends and family because that would also help me out a ton. But I love you guys. Peace.